Yvonne. He's the executive director of the Lawyers for Civil Rights, and he is here to talk to you guys about reparations and give you an opportunity to ask questions and gather more information for your history arguments.
Thank you, Ms. Crossman. Thank you. So we have 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders, and people who seem to be all over the spectrum in terms of whether they are in favor of reparations or against reparations, and then people who just want to learn more and discuss it. As Ms. Crossman said, my name is Yvonne Espinosa. I am the Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights. I'm a lawyer by training. My work focuses on civil rights issues. I've been practicing law now for 15 years. My office is in Boston, and I run an organization called Lawyers for Civil Rights. We provide free legal support to people of color and immigrants on a wide range of different issues, everything from voting rights, housing, and employment discrimination, to helping people start their own small businesses so that we can generate wealth in communities of color. And we work on policing issues, education issues, a wide range of things. A lot of the work that we do at the organization is are big cases, the type of stuff that you see in the newspaper or that you see in the news. And my organization is very old. It's over 50 years old. We were founded in the 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement, at the time when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And we were founded to get lawyers involved in the civil rights movement so that we can move the civil rights struggle from the streets and into the courtroom and use the law as an instrument for social change. And in this area, in the area of Massachusetts, New England, my organization desegregated the public schools. We integrated the public schools so that all of us can go to school with each other and learn from and with each other, and so that we were not segregated. We also integrated housing projects. We integrated the police departments and the fire departments, and that's the reason why today you have black cops, black firefighters. You have Latino cops, Latino firefighters, Asian cops, Asian firefighters. Back in the 1960s, before this work was being done, all of these institutions were segregated. And I hope you all know what that means, right? It means that white people had access to certain things that people who look like us did not have access to. And through the work that we did in the courtrooms, we were able to integrate the institutions so that races were not treated differently, and we were all treated the same. And we had access to the same opportunities and the same institutions, including being able to go to the school and sit in this room together. And so for some of us, including me, right, that seems like a long time ago, right? 1960s. None of us were alive then. I wasn't even alive then, even though I'm sure people think I'm old. But this is work that was done many decades ago, but in a relatively recent time frame. If you fast forward 50 years ago, or go back 50 years ago, the places where we live and the institutions that we have access to looked and felt very different. And a lot of that was the result of racial segregation. A lot of that was the result of racial discrimination. And if you went back even further, right, you would find a lot of more examples of injustice and of discrimination and of segregation. A lot of people tend to think that these things happened in the South, maybe in Alabama or Mississippi, and that things like that never got as bad here. But it's really important to remember that this legacy of racism, and particularly the legacy of slavery in our country, is something that permeated all aspects of our society, even in states like Massachusetts that didn't have slavery in the same way as states in the South. And even though discrimination and segregation looked very different here, let's say in Burlington or Boston, and what it did down in the South, these issues were very much alive and well. Many people think about Martin Luther King and the marches that he led in the South, like the march that he led in Selma, and what he did in DC with the March in the Mall. But some people forget that one of his most important marches took place just in downtown Boston, where he led a march from one of the historically black churches in Roxbury to the Boston Common, asking and demanding for equality and for access and opportunity for people of color right here in Boston, right here in Massachusetts. So you don't have to go to Selma to find examples of MLK right here in our own backyard fighting for racial justice and civil rights. And I think many people forget that. Many people tend to think these things happen far away from where we are, but they didn't. They happened right here. One of the things that he said when he got to the Common was that he wanted Boston to become a testing ground for the ideals of freedom, liberty, and democracy, and that we should be in the cutting edge of things, not following others, but setting an example for how racial justice, civil rights, and diversity can look like and should work like. And I think that's something that's really important, and my organization takes that to heart, and that's what we push for every day. We push for progressive and liberal Massachusetts to be even more inclusive, to be even more equitable, and to make sure that we leave no one behind regardless of their identity or their background. And so I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the issue of reparations, and since that's the thing that brings us here together. I don't know if you guys noticed, but there was a little bit of news back in December that a small town near Chicago passed a municipal ordinance saying that they were going to implement a plan for reparations. The name of the town is Evanston, Illinois. And in Evanston, in December, they decided that even though they had no history of slavery, no history of doing anything particularly bad or that we would consider evil, that they had a moral obligation to move in this direction and to make sure that they would provide reparations for folks in their community. That made a lot of headlines, with people saying, well, this is great, this is the step that every community should be moving into, and other people saying no, that that's not appropriate and that that's not the direction that we should be going in. So I think what's interesting about Evanston, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with it, is that it even happened. I think that a decade ago, 2 decades ago, we wouldn't be sitting here having a conversation about whether reparations are appropriate. But things have moved quickly, right? Especially as Ms. Crossman was talking about, the article by Ta-Nehisi Coates on reparations was a bombshell. It was something that really got on the radar and that made people think about the issue of reparations. And whether you agree or disagree with it, I think, as many of you talked about as you were going around, it's important for us just to even have a conversation about it. And I think it's important to have a conversation about it for a couple of reasons. One is that as a country, we have never dealt with the issue of race at a national level. We had slavery, we had Jim Crow, we had segregation, and we continue to have discrimination, but we've never had a national reckoning with racial justice, or even more fundamentally, with the history and legacy of slavery. Many countries today, when they go through trauma, they have many different ways of trying to bring people together to talk about that and to process that. For example, in countries where people have experienced genocide or war, there are truth and reconciliation commissions that are set up so that people can just talk about their experience, to get all of the truth and facts out there, right? In this country, we've never had anything like that. We've never had something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to talk about what were the facts, what actually happened, what was the experience of people who lived in slavery? What was the experience of people who, even after slavery ended, were still living under black codes and Jim Crow laws? Not just in the South, but in other places. And what was the experience, even in places like Massachusetts, that maybe moved quicker to dismantle many of these things, but it still continued to have many manifestations of injustice? We've never had anything like that. And I think that that puts us apart even with other countries that have experienced racial justice issues. Think about South Africa and the way that in South Africa they formally had the equivalent of what we had, of Jim Crow and many different legalized segregation through apartheid. They called it something different, but it was the same thing. And after apartheid was dismantled, they set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to talk about what exactly people lived through, what they experienced under apartheid, and why it was important to have these conversations, just to have the conversation about what happened. And as a lawyer, I think I understand a lot of that, because I see many clients whose rights have been violated and they want their day in court. And whether they win in court or lose in court is less important than having an opportunity to be heard, having an opportunity to tell your story, to have a judge listen to that. And maybe the judge is going to rule against you, but just the fact that you have your day in court is so important for the clients who we represent. Because when you take a case as a lawyer, you can never guarantee an outcome. You don't know if you're going to win, you don't know if you're going to lose. You may win a lot of the time. That doesn't mean you're going to have a 100% winning streak. And so you can never guarantee an outcome. You have to prepare your clients to lose, but also prepare your client to be able to be a witness, to get on the stand and tell their story, tell their truth, and to seek justice and see where the cards may land and fall, right? And so I think I understand a little bit about why in countries like South Africa, telling your story has been such an important part of the process of healing. Not just healing, but overcoming trauma, discrimination, oppression, and other injustices. I would say, if you ask me, right, because the issue of reparation is very controversial, very, very controversial, and it's very heated and it's polarized. People feel very strongly one way or the other. I think one of the things that we could potentially be starting with is just having a conversation about what our experience of racism as a country looked like and continues to look like. Just the other day, like about a week or two ago, and I would love for you guys to look it up, they found in Tulsa a mass grave that people believe is connected to the Tulsa riots, which happened in the early 1900s. Tulsa had one of the most affluent black communities in the country. You know, people called it like the Black Wall Street. It was very, very affluent. And there was an incident where a young black man was accused of having sexually abused a white woman. There was that allegation, and there was a strong sense that the young black man was not going to get justice, that he was just going to get totally railroaded. And so the black community came out to protest in the courthouse. And white people felt that that this was very threatening, that the black people should not be out there in front of the courthouse trying to push for the freedom of this young black man who had been accused. And it created a significant amount of panic and anxiety. And shortly thereafter, the white folks went through the black community and destroyed it. Countless blocks, not just one block. I mean, this was an entire neighborhood. And they bombed them. Yes, yeah. So, I mean, when we just, and the reason why I brought this up is because they just found a mass grave, right? There are people who never even knew that the Tulsa riots had happened. People who never knew that there was a affluent black community in Tulsa that was completely decimated by racial hatred and a white mob. Yeah, it was actually one of the few places where, well, not few, but there were pockets of very well organized and middle class, affluent black communities in many places in the country. Tulsa happened to be probably one of the largest. And this was in the early 1900s, before a lot of the racial justice things that we talk about really came into play anywhere. I mean, one important date to remember, and that I never forget as a civil rights lawyer, is that the Supreme Court integrated public schools in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. And that case was the trigger for the integration of institutions across the country. So before 1954, legally, integration was not required at any institution, not just schools, but in any other place. And so if we're talking about anything that happened before 1954, to answer your question, we're talking about a time, regardless of where you are in the country, where integration was not legally required by the Supreme Court. That didn't become the rule of the land across the entire country until 1954. So if you're seeing examples historically of whether it's black success or of oppression, think about that as a time frame. In Boston, we integrated the public schools in 1974, 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Think about that. Think about how it took us 2 more decades to be able to actually implement Brown versus Board of Education here in the North, in Massachusetts. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of stuff at you and would love to answer more questions, because I could be here talking for hours and that wouldn't be useful. So I would love to get some questions going to see exactly what you guys are thinking about. How can I be useful as a primary source for you guys as you're going through this exercise? Any questions that you guys have? Don't be shy.
Do you think reparations are going to help America push forward in the country?
You know, the issue of reparations, like I said, is very controversial. And I think it also depends on how you define reparations. You know, are you talking about giving people some type of monetary compensation? Or are you talking about more symbolic, but I think meaningful things that could be done? One I think important example, before I forget it, is the new museum that opened up through Brian Stevenson's work. He's a civil rights lawyer, much more successful than me, so he gets museums built. And he built a museum basically to showcase the history and legacy of lynching. And so there are memorials in this museum. You guys should look it up because it's visually stunning. I mean, just looking at the pictures, it's really, really stunning. There are commemorative pieces throughout the museum. Each stands for one person who was lynched and tells the story of what happened. And not just, you know, in that particular community, but across the country, which is something that people forget, that there was lynching across the country. So I think the answer to your question is very complex, because, you know, I think we should be thinking about these things even without having the conversation about reparations. We should be dedicating more resources to researching slavery and its effects and its legacy. Things like lynching and this memorial that just opened up, so that people can learn more about the truth. These are things that are not just symbolic. These are things that could really change the way that people talk, that people think about our history of racism in this country. You know, In Boston, we don't even have a memorial to MLK yet. There's right now conversations about putting a memorial for MLK. You know, something like that I think should be a no-brainer. You know, before we have to get to the issue of, you know, do we compensate people or not, I think that there are lower hanging fruit that we should be doing. Put a memorial for MLK in the spot where he talked in the Common, right, where he led the march. You know, who would be opposed to that? You know, a way to commemorate MLK's incredible connection with Boston and with their civil rights community, right? Where I can go check it out, you guys could go check it out, we could all go check it out, right? So I think there are low-hanging fruit that some people may consider in the bucket of reparations that I think would be a lot less controversial, but powerful and meaningful to get the conversation rolling, even if it takes the shape of an MLK Memorial. Or maybe if we dedicate some resources to really researching the history of the role that slavery played in our public institutions. You know, slavery and slaveholders, a lot of money that was made through the slave trade went to pay for many things in this community. You know, there are, if you look it up, for example, there have been, and I'll get to your question in one sec, there's been an ongoing conversation about whether universities should be acknowledging the role that slavery and that slave money played in their endowments, right? And they've been renaming, in some instances, colleges that were named, or houses or different buildings that were named after slaveholders, everywhere from Harvard to Brown University and many other places. So these are active conversations that are happening that I think are important to have, even if it's short of saying we're going to be dedicating money to reparations.
What if you gave people land for reparations? Because couldn't you say like African Americans, like without slavery and like without them, America wouldn't be built?
You know, it's interesting. I think the idea of giving people land.
We just got like our own piece of land, so we should. We deserve it.
But what about Native Americans? They were here first. And
Right.
the white people took care.
Yeah, but like
So it's technically-
still they made money off of us, so we should get our money back.
Well, that.
I'm not like being rude to
No, yeah. Well, I think I think the idea of land is interesting. You know, I don't think it's practical necessarily to give people land, because most land is already under private ownership. And so how are you going to displace somebody who already owns the land if it's already been privately disposed of, right? So that's, I think, an issue with the idea of giving people land. But what you mention about land is interesting in that the federal government has had in the past different programs and incentives. For example, one of the reasons why the suburban communities exist is because the federal government made very affordable, low-interest loans available for people who were interested in buying houses. Those are programs that really don't exist anymore, right? So maybe it's not about giving people land, but maybe it's about having either a local, state, or federal program that allows for easier access to home ownership by providing people with resources to be able to buy a home. So
I mean, like a piece of land where we get to run it. Nobody else gets to come in and like do what they want to do. Like we get to call our own. Like how you said, like integration. Once we integrated, like didn't we lose like everything that we got to call our own? Like didn't we have like a train station? Didn't we have like a bunch of businesses and jobs like Wall Street? But then like once we integrated, then we couldn't have anything to call our own. I just want to like
I hear you. I completely hear you. I think even here in Burlington, all the land is already accounted for. So how is anybody going to give you a piece of land? Well, I think you're raising a very interesting and provocative idea, but I would like to channel you more to think about what are ways that the government has in the past helped people buy land, and what are ways that the government could today replicate and update a program like that, like a low interest mortgage program that would allow people to be able to have easier access to home ownership, which is essentially what you're talking about. I'm just calling it home ownership and you want land, but home ownership gives you a house with land, right? So,
We can't move our house to trash.
but
We want like our own land so we can build our own houses and be like when we buy houses from like other corporations or like other like insurance companies, it's garbage.
well, it's not, you know, I'll give you some pushback on that. I don't think it's all garbage or trash, but I think that even that, right, if you are concerned that there are communities that should look and feel different, then maybe there should be a greater government investment in revitalizing communities, right? We've seen some of this already. This isn't, you know, rocket science or anything that's new. This has been done many times before, where you have, for example, a community development corporation, a CDC, that invests in making sure that Main Street looks pretty, that all of the buildings, you know, have windows that are unbroken, that all the signage is nice, right? Like all of these things are things that exist in many different ways. Maybe we need to think about retooling some of the ways that already local, state government and private players are working in spaces of community redevelopment and revitalization to make sure that those efforts are community driven and not just top down, to make sure that people like you are in the driver's seat helping to push for what you think are meaningful interventions in the community, right?
Like you said about like the streets looking nice, like I don't know, they don't like the streets looking nice, but it feels like they just stop at like one certain point. Because like if you look at like California, and like all of you, like when you go down there, you see the palm trees, it looks mad nice, and once you reach like Watts and Compton, those areas, it just stops.
Yeah, but that's what I mean by, that's precisely what I mean. We need to find better ways of investing in communities. And we don't have to, you know, recreate the wheel here. There are many programs, many of these are called Main Streets programs in many cities, even in Boston and other communities, where you're talking about helping small businesses to create jobs at the community level, where you're talking about helping entrepreneurs to launch their businesses, where you're talking about helping to clean up streets and make sure that they all have those nice palm trees like the ones that you saw in Los Angeles. You know, I think you're onto something. I think you're in the right neighborhood, but in the wrong house. I think you should think about how some of the existing tools could help get you where you want to be, which is having people be empowered and economically viable through home ownership or land ownership or whatever you want to call it. But I think that there are ways to do that without giving people land or without taking land from people who already own it. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to work within the system to get you where you want to be. Okay, well, I'll get back to you. But other questions? So moving away from land for a minute, other questions? No? No other questions? Come on. He can't be the only one who has questions about this stuff. Come
What
on.
are reparations to you? Like exactly, like what are other ways than the MLK
Memorial.
Yeah.
Or symbolic manifestations of equality. You know, I think we already have some of these things. I think the problem is that they're not extensive enough, right? Like there should be something that matters to you guys, because I really hope all of you are aspiring to go to college. You know, how affordable is college? How are people, especially people who are lower income, able to go to school? You know, I was raised by a single mom in a very low income community. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I'm the first professional in my family. And having access to student loans and to grants so that I didn't have to take out old loans is really important, right? So what are we doing to continue to invest in pathways, pipelines for getting people into college and for getting them into college affordably? That's another thing that I think is really important, right? How do we invest not just in programs that are going to create small businesses or revitalize neighborhoods or incentivize home ownership, but also promote college education as a pathway for success and to do it affordably? You know, that's, for example, I think another really interesting way of thinking about equity and thinking about this issue of reparations creatively and broadly, right? And in a way that helps to lift a lot more boats than just a one-dimensional solution that targets just one community. We're thinking about many other people who are similarly situated and disadvantaged and who could benefit from that, you know? So that's one additional thought. And I'm wondering if people have other things that they're thinking about as you've been hearing me talk about different opportunities. What else are people thinking about? I know you're thinking land. But what else?
Do you think if African Americans get reparations, other people start to want to get reparations too?
That's a very fair question. You know, slavery directly affected one community, the African American community. That doesn't mean that other communities haven't experienced hardship. I think somebody already mentioned Native Americans and how they were forcibly displaced and housed in reservations, which if you do some research on that, you'll see that those are really terrible conditions for the most part. So there are definitely other communities that have already been raised here that have a history of being marginalized that I think is also important to recognize. So I think your question is a very fair one in terms of what precedent are you setting, right? If you do it for one group, does that create an obligation or an expectation that other groups would have to receive something? And I think that's a very fair question, and that's why I think it's important to think about if you're pushing for something like reparations, what you're pushing for, I think, needs to be thought about through that lens in terms of similar to what I was talking about with opportunities for college and scholarships, right? Like, are you only making those opportunities available to one community, or are you making those opportunities available to a broader set of folks who have been disadvantaged, right? And so I think that's a really important question, and there's no right answer to this, right? There's no silver bullet, but I think the more folks we can empower and protect, the better. And so I would love to see something that lifts all boats as opposed to something that lifts only one boat, right? If we're making opportunities for college or home ownership or for starting a small business available, there are many people who could benefit from that. And so I think the spirit of what you do could be done in a way that is equitable, fair, but that also focuses on broader communities. But that's not to say that there aren't legitimate reasons why specific reparations shouldn't focus on the communities that were most affected by issues of slavery and Jim Crow, right? And the lynching we were just talking about. And so, you know, I think that's a very fair question, and I think it's one of the things that you're going to be wrestling with in terms of, you know, who has access to the opportunity or program that you're creating? How do you define the group that qualifies for that? I think that's a very fair question. And I think you should be thinking creatively and I hope broadly, but I don't think there is a specific silver bullet for that question. But it's a good one. You know, I think anything should be fair game for an election, right? Any question people have about a policy issue should be acceptable, is my view, right? You should be asking people what they think about anything that concerns you, right? There are people who are really passionate about gun violence or gun rights, right? Both sides of the coin. That's a fair issue for elections. So why shouldn't the issue of things that are maybe more controversial or polarizing like reparations be allowed? I mean, we're having a lot of conversation right now in this election season about immigration, right? And so I think all of these things should be fair game. I don't think we should have to hold back on questions that we ask to any candidate, whether it's a local candidate, a state candidate, or a candidate running for national office. I think all of us should be able to ask whatever questions are important to us about the policies that matter to us, the issues that matter to each of us. And so I don't think that anything should be off the table, right? Okay. Anything else people are thinking about? Good question, by the way. Thank you guys for joining. Okay, please.
So you think that certain reparations should be designated to a certain community?
Well, I think that could be an approach, right? I think it depends on what exactly you're trying to do. You know, what exactly the reparations look like. You know, we were talking before about, should reparations be a monetary compensation, or should it be other things like the programs that I was talking about, right? I think it really depends on what the program you're pushing for is, and like I said, how you define the people who qualify. So if you want to, you certainly could have a program that is limited to the African American community. Absolutely. But I think there were some interesting questions, even right when we were talking about the issue of land. There were some interesting questions about other people who don't have access to land, right? Like the Native American folks. So I think these things, we have to think about how we would address that, right? We're creating a program that benefits let's say a small subset of people, and then what happens to requests for similar protection that come from the Native American community? How would you address that? I think you should think about, if you're pushing for reparations and for a particular type of reparation, I think you need to think about who would qualify for that and how you're going to address concerns that that group is either too big or too small. You're including too many people or you're not including enough people. And so I think I challenge you to think about that as your thing. If you're pushing for a particular thing through this project and based on what you're going to argue for, you need to also think about what is it that you're talking about in terms of reparations, because reparations could mean many different things. And then who would qualify for that? And what criteria would you use for that? And why are you using that criteria? You know, you need to be able to have a criteria that makes sense based on what you're doing, and you need to be able to defend that. So what is the criteria that you're defining? What is the type of reparations that you're asking for, if that's what you're going to be pushing for? You know? Because like I said, there could be a lot of things that you could be talking about that fall, way beyond just the idea of giving people money. So I'm trying to make you guys think a little bit more creatively about what this could look like so that you're not thinking about it just one-dimensionally about giving money to one community. Think about it broader and think about it more creatively in terms of different things that even the government has done before that the government could be doing now, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at here, if that makes sense. So not sure if you guys know too much about this, but Japanese Americans were subjected to being detained by the federal government during World War II. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing us into World War II, there was a strong anti-Japanese sentiment. This idea that Japanese Americans, based on their heritage and background, would be Japanese sympathizers or Japanese spies. And so the federal government reacted by authorizing concentration camps for Japanese Americans. And people were held in these concentration camps, in these internment camps, and eventually released, of course. But the idea that people are being dragged from their homes and detained and confined in these miserable conditions, literally in concentration camps, is a very shameful part of our history in America, and something that was a direct result of our participation in World War II and our animosity with Japan after Pearl Harbor. So there have been a series of things that happened in connection with the Japanese internment. One was that Japanese Americans were able to push for monetary compensation based on their internment in these camps. And so I think that's an interesting thing for you guys to look into in terms of how that worked. This of course affected a very small community, particularly in the West Coast, and the federal government took a long time to do it, but the federal government did something to make sure that people were being adequately treated after what they experienced. I tend to think about this in the same way that the law treats people who've been wrongfully confined. You know how sometimes people are accused of a crime they didn't commit, and maybe there's DNA evidence that exonerates them, that shows that they did not commit the crime? That is happening a lot these days because of advanced technology where you're able to collect and analyze the DNA evidence and show that that person is not the perpetrator. That person is not the one who committed the rape or committed the murder or committed whatever charge is being presented. These people who are freed after being wrongfully confined often sue the state, and the state will provide them with compensation for the time that they spent confined improperly, because they were locked up for no good reason. They didn't commit the crime. And so the law recognizes very strongly the idea that if you've been wrongfully confined and detained, that you need to be compensated for that. And you see it in the news every once in a while. If you just Google exonerated by DNA evidence, you'll see that this happens with alarming frequency because they get the wrong person. And that as a result of that, people are provided with compensation. And so the idea of being illegally confined or detained, whether it's by the state or by the government, and being able to have compensation for the time that you spent being confined improperly, something that's very well established by the law. I think just to play devil's advocate here, the difficult part about analogizing this to the context of slavery and reparations is that the underlying offense took place many generations ago, and people aren't being confined against their will right now. And so I think that is one of the challenging aspects of importing this analogy into the idea of reparations, but I just raise it as a possible thing for you guys to be thinking about, so I welcome the question. And I think it's good for you guys to know that that happened, that there's precedent for that, and that there's also precedent for being able to compensate people who've been wrongfully confined, right? Which some people may analogize to having been a slave because you were confined under the auspices of the law, because the law allowed for your confinement improperly. And so something to think about as you're talking about the issues of reparations, an interesting potential analogy, or not, as the case may be if you're on the other side. You know, when it comes to elections, whether it's local, state, or for national office, that all of these issues should be on the table. You know, people talk about immigration, people talk about gun control, people talk about gun rights, right? All of these things should be on the table for people to talk about. It's important for any issue that matters to you guys to be a part of the national discussion, I feel. It's all fair game to be able to find out what your candidate thinks about it. You know, just like we talk about climate issues, environmental rights, immigrants' rights, all of these things are fair game to know where that particular politician falls in these issues. And they may or may not answer the question, but just having an opportunity to ask, I think, is really important and a part of dialogue and a part of the democratic process of hearing candidates on the issues that matter the most to you, you know? So I think that's really important. And I think we should be asking candidates what they think about, you know, how expensive college is getting and what are they doing to fix that? How expensive housing is getting and what are they doing to fix that, right? Any of these issues that we've been talking about, I think, are fair game.
I don't know who asked it. A student asked who should be on that commission. Is that something that you have thoughts about? If we get to the point where we are officially studying reparations, who participates in that discussion?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, it's something that, you know, oftentimes, especially if this is something that the feds are going to push, they're going to try to make it, of course, and they should, a bipartisan commission, a bipartisan process, which means that you're going to have people who represent Democrats and who represent Republicans on the commission. And who you select to be on the commission might be a deeply political process, right? People are going to be appointed potentially by, you know, the congressman or by somebody else in DC. But I think it's really important to have a community voice and a community perspective in those spaces, right? We were talking before about how those nice palm trees end just as you got to Watts or Compton. Maybe it's because the efforts that are fixing that or that are pushing for that or not pushing for that is not representative of the community. There isn't enough community involvement and engagement. You need to be able to have community voice and perspective in this process so that what people want to see can happen. You know, so I think community inclusion is critical in that. It can't just be politicians sitting around a room trying to make a decision for you, for us. And it can't just be politically appointed, well-connected people who are pushing for that. There needs to be a vehicle for community inclusion in all of these conversations, whether it's in a commission to study the issue or whether it's even in more local efforts to revitalize communities. All of these may be in different scales because of what we're talking about, whether it's local or national, but all of these efforts need to have community inclusion, so it's community driven, so the people like us are there.
Well, that's not happening. There's no, like, the communities aren't coming together.
We forget that the politicians work for us and not the other way around.
Yeah.
They're accountable to you when you turn 18 and you go out and cast your vote. It is so important for us, regardless of our political affiliation, regardless of whether you're liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, blue or red, to be civically engaged, to vote, to call your elected officials and push for whatever is the issue that you guys want, whether it's gun control or more guns. Doesn't matter, as long as you are making your voice and perspective heard. And that's the only way that we can push back against the trend that you're talking about. Now, we have to be able to hold our elected officials accountable. We elect them. You elect them when you go out to vote. Your taxpayer dollars pays their salary. There's a reason why we call them public servants. They work for us and not the other way around. And we need to be comfortable in doing that, holding them accountable and making sure that they're doing the work that they're supposed to be doing for us.
Are you allowed to vote more than once, like in a different town?
No, that's vote fraud. You can't do that. You vote once in your town for whoever you want. But yes, but I think it is really important, you know.
Can you vote outside your town even if you live in a different town?
Well, that gets technical, maybe with an absentee ballot or something like that. But no, you have to vote where you're registered to vote, wherever that town is, wherever that jurisdiction is, you know. But I think going back full circle with the questions that we've been talking about, if you care about the issue of reparation, call your elected officials and find out what's their stance. Do they even have a stance on it? You know, whether the stance is pro or against. You know, but I think it would be really interesting to hear what their stance is, right? And to make sure that you also share your stance with them. Even if you don't vote, each of those representatives represents your interests because you are their constituency. You live in their district. And so I encourage you to ask the politicians, like, where do you fall on this issue? And share your own views of this. And not just on this issue, but on anything else that you care about, that you want to see done. I think it's important for us not to get disengaged from the process. I think it's important for us to engage even more if we are displeased with what politicians are doing.
But like you said, it's not just the politician, it has to be community too.
Yes, it has to be community. It has to be community driven. The politicians are not going to do what you want unless they hear from you and unless we push for community-driven processes. It is really, really important. If you don't like the way that they're appointing people to a commission or committee to study something, say something about it. I think that's so important, and we lose sight of the fact that we can influence the process by contacting elected officials to express our views on different issues. Whether you're pro or against or whatever your political persuasion may be, it doesn't matter. We have that right. That is a fundamental right under our democracy, and it's critical for us to use that, to make sure that we're using that. Okay, and you know, since politicians normally don't hear from teenagers, if you actually reach out and you say, you know, my name is so-and-so, I'm a student in Burlington High School, I'm one of your constituents, I live in your community, I think you'd be surprised to see that they actually pay attention to it. Because folks like you don't normally call, don't normally write, don't normally approach them about issues. And so I think it's going to make quite an impression to hear from younger perspectives and voices on what you guys want, regardless of what the issue may be or regardless of where you and your families are politically. I think any issue is fair game when it comes to our political representation. And so what I encourage you to be is civically engaged and use your voice, because we all have that power of self-advocacy for ourselves, for our families, and for our communities. And like I said, you know, I think it's going to make a splash to get something from you guys, because folks like you guys don't constantly call or write. So take advantage of it. Take advantage of the fact that you will have a captive audience when you reach out.